everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words, the show where every episode I talk to writers, editors, occasionally agents about them, the work they do, and hopefully how their experiences and insights can help you in your own writing journey. Now, before I introduce my guest today, I want to take a moment and suggest, please, that you hit the subscribe button so you never miss a future episode. If you like what you hear today, maybe you would even be so kind as to tell a friend. It is the best way for such endeavors as mine to gain an audience. It's been working pretty well so far. I really appreciate everyone who has done that, whether they've just hit subscribe or maybe tell someone about it. If you wanted to leave a nice review, that would be great too. All deeply appreciated. That is the end of my commercial, and we're just going to get on with it now. So, my guest today is a really multifaceted author, editor, and journalist, which I always love because you all know I'm a political reporter. His work includes short stories, a couple of nonfiction books, which we'll talk about a little briefly too. He's edited one of the really great noir anthologies out there, the Columbus Noir anthology, easy for me to say. And he's the author of the Andy Hayes Private Eye series, which features a former Cleveland Browns and Ohio State quarterback who's now turned into an investigator. He's here today to talk about his brand new thriller starring a new protagonist named Mercury Carter, who is a former postal inspection agent who must track down a violent crew of kidnappers across the Midwest to rescue a woman that they have taken. I'm not sure if it's hostage or for other reasons. I am reading it right now. I will tell you, it's a really good read, and I'm really enjoying it. And let's please welcome Andrew Welsh-Huggins to the open mic. How are you doing today, sir?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So good to be
Oh,
here.
thrilled to have you here. Like I say, I'm reading the book right now. It's called The Mailman, for those who are uh, interested in such things. It's getting great reviews, and since I'm reading it right now, I can honestly say that I concur with all of the reviews that have been keeping praise on it. It's a really fast-paced read. It's got great, sharp dialogue, a lot of tension right from page one, and so definitely something I'm enjoying. Andrew, for the uninitiated out there, please tell us a little bit more about the mailman.
Yeah, well, thanks. Happy to, and thanks again for having me. Yeah, so The Mailman is it is the beginning of a new series. It's very much in the thriller genre. My character, as you said, is he's something that probably doesn't really exist in real life. He's a freelance courier, so he's someone who is hired to deliver items, information, occasionally people. Um, Things that people want delivered sort of off the books. He does not deliver illegal things. He's not like a drug courier. He would never do anything like that. And sometimes his deliveries are pretty innocuous, as he likes to say. Sometimes in a given year, his most popular delivery is French bulldog puppies. But the conceit of the series is that he has never missed a delivery, and he'll do pretty much anything to keep that streak alive. And so I've this is my first full-length book about Mercury Carter. I've also published 5 short stories about him, and basically in each of those, he's either delivering something that's important that bad guys try to stop, or he's delivering something pretty innocuous and he stumbles across a crime or recipients of a package who are in trouble, and he has to spring into action. And that's sort of the case in the Mailman, the book that is just about to come out, where he is delivering something relatively small to attorney Rachel Stanfield in her suburban Indianapolis home. He's completely unaware that inside the home, Rachel and her husband, Glenn, are being held captive by this gang of home invaders who are about to torture them for information that they believe Rachel has. Rachel is terrified and clueless as to anything that's going on. It's not looking good, and suddenly the doorbell rings. And as soon as one of the bad guys answers the door, Carter realizes something's up and springs into action. So, yeah, that's the conceit. He's fictionally from Rochester, New York, but the series is his adventures so far have been set all over the country. This one is set in and around Indianapolis and Chicago. He's been to Toronto. He's been to Virginia. In the sequel, he'll be heading out to the East Coast to in and around Providence, Rhode Island. So very much a person whose job takes him to different places.
You mentioned, of course, that he's essentially stumbled into this situation where, this couple is being held captive, and yet, of course, he does know what to do. It's not his first rodeo, so to speak. And I found that was an interesting premise because when you start reading the book, and I don't want to give away too much of anything to anybody, I always want to make sure people are inspired to go read the book, but I'm not giving away too many details. The conversation that this couple is having, anyone who's been married for 5 minutes, and especially if you have stepkids. Now, my wife is the stepmother to our daughter, who's now in her 30s and everything, but I can remember having similar conversations about what is happening with your stepchild. And it felt so real to me. It's so funny that that's the thing, of course, that caught my attention right off the bat. And that's why I said the tension starts even before the bad guys get there, because there's something that's a little off with the way that the husband is acting, right? So you did a really great job of foreshadowing just in this very domestic conversation that I think most people can relate to. But as it goes on, you do a really great job of hinting back to that difference, that there was something going on there. And I had to go back and read it. Said, oh yeah, I picked up on it, but I wasn't quite sure what it was I was picking up on. And so I thought that was really, really good writing, really solid writing, because you said a lot by really kind of just saying a little or not saying the thing that you would think. It wasn't beating someone over the head with that tension, but you set it up pretty nicely. So I wanted to give you a kudo on that because I really thought that was a nice intro that was layered.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And as it goes on, of course, one of the first things aside from that that came to my mind was I don't think I've ever read a story where the protagonist had that job, a former U.S. postal inspector. And as you say, maybe there's not even, though actually I know somebody who was um, trying to get, there is some, I'm not sure what the exact term is. Maybe it is an inspector. They have their own police force, I guess, to some extent. But I'm curious, what was the inspiration for Mercury Carter? Because I've seen, most of those are ex-military or they're some kind of ex something, so they have all these skills, but I've never seen it be a postal inspector. What was the inspiration for Mercury Carter?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I'll say I mean, if after this talk and after the book comes out, if I'm contacted by a bunch of freelance couriers, I'll let you know. The So the job, the United States Postal Inspection Service is very much a proud federal law enforcement agency. What attracted to me to that for his background is that they may not like me saying this, but to a degree, I think it's a bit of an underdog agency. A lot of people, even people in law enforcement, don't realize that it's essentially the equivalent of the FBI or the DEA. These are fully sworn federal police officers. They have all the same arrest powers and investigative powers that an FBI agent would have. But a lot of people don't realize that, and they think, well, they just like make sure the mail is being delivered okay, which is honestly, there's a lot of crime that happens in the postal world, and that's one of the things that made sense for this guy for his background. But before we get to all that, I will say, I guess I was lucky in the sense of Carter just kind of appeared to me in my head as this sort of fully formed short story came to me several years ago, and I was just minding my own business, and this idea came to me of a sort of slight, unassuming guy, not a big hulking person at all, but he's been tapped to help chaperone a young woman, a young mother, and her young daughter away from an abusive marriage. And I had this notion of Carter escorting her and becoming aware suddenly that they're being tailed and having to spring into action. And that's where this sort of Carter has a bit of he's very single-minded, and this idea that he absolutely is steadfast that he is not going to miss a delivery, and um, he will do pretty much anything. So there's certainly he will certainly unleash violence in a way that people might find surprising, but it's all sort of it's all in the guise of helping the people he's either delivering or taking stuff to. So that's how he came about. I just had this idea for a short story. This happens to me rarely, but it was one of these stories that honestly, it was a question of how fast could I type to write the story down. That does not happen to me a lot, but in this case, I was lucky. So that's where he came from. That was published in 2020 in this great anthology series called Mickey Finn 21st Century Noir, published by Down and Out Books, edited by Michael Bracken. Wonderful ongoing. I think they're up to, I think the sixth anthology was just published. So I, like anybody, like any author character, I started learning about my own character, and I wrote wrote and published several more short stories about him, and then got to work on the full-length novel, The Mailman. And it was sort of through that process that I developed this backstory, and I realized it made sort of perfect sense that his his father was a real mailman, a person who walked the neighborhoods of Rochester, New York, delivering mail. And then, for various reasons, Carter ends up, after college, joining the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, actually serves as a federal agent. The backstory, which people can read about, ends up with him leaving that service, and he's trying to figure out what to do. Somebody suggests that his uncle actually says, "Hey, somebody I know has something they need delivered. Would you have? I know you're out of work. Do you have any interest in delivering this thing?" And he does that. One thing leads to another, and this kind of unorthodox profession grew out of that.
I find it really interesting too. And I really find it interesting the idea that it came out of short stories because I was going to ask you about short stories anyway. So let me just speed ahead a little bit and I'll circle back to the other things I was going to hit up on. But, you know, short stories are such a great way for many things, right? They can really, especially when you're young in your writing career, are a great way to work that muscle and to learn how to tell stories and economy of writing and, not wasting words and all of that kind of thing. But I love hearing when a character has developed into a longer story from a shorter one. And, it doesn't sound like you really intended it to ever be more than one short story, but it sounds like maybe it has grown organically from where that first one was to this. When did you ever get a sense, hey, maybe what I really need to do is give this character a full-length novel?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And certainly, I mean, with my Andy Hayes Private Eye series, I did it backwards. I'd published 3 or 4 books before I started writing short stories about that character. And so I've now published several short stories about that character. But yes, in this case, Carter definitely started as a short story character. I would say um, the third story where he ends up he's delivering something to an epidemiologist in Des Moines, and it was that point that I realized that honestly it was just I was enjoying spending so much. I was enjoying spending time with Carter so much that I wanted to um, take him on a bigger adventure. So yeah, 2 or 3 short stories in, and again the opening that we've talked about of the mailman, that is another scene that just it came to me several years ago. I mean, as I was working on Carter stories, and I just this scene stuck with me of on one side of a door, this horrible stuff is happening in this home, and the other side of the door is Carter kind of minding his business, ringing the doorbell, and um, I was just so propelled by that scene that I finally figured out how I could use that to launch an entire adventure. And in that old pantser plotter debate, I'm actually a reformed pantser, so I do outline a fair amount now before I start writing. And honestly what I've learned through trial and error is that, outlining and plotting, that's just a form of pantsing. you know, you're still looking at a blank page trying to figure out what happens next. And what
Yeah.
I like about it is that, to a degree, it helps streamline the process. So, when I was working off less of an outline, I would say I probably went down a few too many rabbit holes, that I had to come back from, and by outlining more, that helps me stick to a path. So anyway, long answer, but yeah, I've written and published, close to my 50th short story coming soon, and I I love the short story form. There are quite a lot of markets for mystery short fiction still. We've had a couple of setbacks recently in terms of some really great magazines, but I do like to encourage people, that if you're interested in writing mystery short fiction, there's still a ton of opportunities. News Alert, you're not going to make a very big living off of it, but certainly lots of great opportunities to get your name out there in wonderful magazines and great anthologies.
Yeah, there are a lot of really good ones. I'm a big fan of. I've read a lot of Black Cat Mystery and Hillary Queen and Shotgun Honey. You know, yeah, it's always tough when one of them goes away because, I really do enjoy, and I love anthologies. I really do enjoy anthologies and crime fiction, and some of the best storytelling out there is in, 1,500 words or less. I'm
Yeah,
so appreciative and have so much admiration for a really well told short story. You can get an awful lot in such a small package, and I really, I'm going to echo those words. I think, man, even if just as a reader, if you haven't discovered them, I like to tell this story years ago, and a previous agent of mine. Um, she was having trouble selling a nonfiction book I was working on. It's a whole nother story I'm going to leave there. But she asked if I had anything else I was working on. And I said, well, not working on, but I had this idea. I kept kicking around this thing. This was in the early 90s, I think, maybe somewhere mid 90s. And I said, I just had this idea about maybe writing a bunch of short stories based on Rolling Stone songs. Her face lit up. She was, oh, that's a good idea. You should do that. Okay, well, being stubborn, I was still so wedded to this other project. I kept hammering that nail for 2 more years until it completely damn near killed me. Well, of course, unless you've been living in a cave anywhere for the last 10 years, there's a million of these anthologies now based on the songs of everybody from the Stones to the Go-Go's to Jimmy Buffett and every other thing. And a lot of them are very, very good. Some of them are not, I'll be really honest with you. But I thought, man, when am I going to listen when someone in the industry tells you, hey, your current idea is terrible, but this one is really good. I should have
yeah,
listened. And I
yeah,
not that it would have made it that much difference, I suppose, but I've always thought of that. And I think it is because though there is a big market, again, not a huge paying market, but there's a big creative market interest for people who can tell good stories in a short form. And when you're reading at night in bed and you can read one story each night, I think a lot of
exactly.
people like to do that. So
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun, I think. I want to circle back here a little bit because, I've seen in some of the commentary on the book, and I should preface, we're talking here today, a couple of weeks before the book comes out. But by the time my audience is listening to this, the book will probably have just been hitting the market. So when I talk about it having just come out, that's because that's probably about going to line up with when you're listening to it. But I was thinking about some of the Jack Reacher comparisons, and of course, you know, Jack Reacher is this iconic character created by Lee Child. Now we've seen, their Amazon series, etc. But I think when I see comparisons like that just feels like so much pressure on the author, right? Because it's creating such an expectation in a reader's head. Oh, this is a Jack Reacher character. And I'm just wondering from you as a writer, when you hear that or someone says that, was that a little bit of your intention? Did you have that thought in your mind whether it's from the short story or later on when you decided to do a full-length novel with Mercury Carter, that you wanted that character to be a little bit like Jack Reacher, or
Yeah.
a Jack Reacher like character. I'm not going to say you were trying to copy Lee Child. I just mean a character like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. Like, gosh, no pressure. So I certainly will say that I do owe a big debt to Lee Child. I've loved those Jack Reacher novels. I can't say I've read every one of them, but I've read a lot. And in terms of formulating my character, I think the one thing that really appealed to me, has always appealed to me about those books, is this idea of, to a degree, Reacher is kind of always minding his own business and trouble comes to him. Um, and that I've always appreciated that concept. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I've always appreciated about those books is that many of them take place outside of big cities. Reacher often finds himself getting off a bus at a crossroads in the Midwest or the South or some fly speck town, and ends up stumbling across these huge conspiracies. And I like that. I really like this idea of books that step away from the big big places where we think of mysteries happening. Now that said, I've certainly read a really dynamic Reacher story set right in New York City, so there's that. And you have to admire Lee Child, who I think most people probably know is actually from the UK, but he has ended up creating possibly the most iconic American uh, protagonist in crime fiction. So I would say those two things were on my mind. But I would say, um, I wanted to create a different conceit for Carter. Obviously, Reacher is a guy who literally has no possessions, no address. I think, as far as I can tell, he owns a toothbrush and maybe a money clip. Now, I think in the later books, Child finally bowed to reality and might have given him like a flip phone or something. But Carter is very different in that sense. He's married. He has a home he goes home to in Rochester. He works with his uncle, who's kind of his unofficial dispatcher. He drives a Chevy Suburban that he owns. He does carry a gun. Um, and But what I think he shares in common, and again, is that idea that Carter is just a guy trying to make a delivery. He just wants to get this package that he's been paid to deliver. He wants to get it to the person, and he wants to go home so he can kick back, spend some time with his wife, maybe catch a ball game. He's a huge baseball fan. Um, and and then the second part of that is his adventures do tend to happen in places that are certainly places that I love. The story I wrote about him, set in Des Moines, is one of my absolute favorite stories. But that said, the story that came after that I set in Toronto, which obviously is a big international city.
Sure.
Uh, but uh, Still, the conceit's the same. He's in the Toronto story. He knocks on a door, hoping to deliver this necklace to an elderly woman, and then turn around and get across the border before nightfall. And just it doesn't work out that way.
You know, Jack Reacher as a character, of course, he's very smart. He was part of a military investigations unit, so he's very smart. But it's also very much a part of that character that he's this huge guy, 6'6", 250 pounds of raw muscle. The physicality part of him is very critical to that character. One of the things that strikes me as I'm reading, Mercury Carter is, I don't really necessarily get that same sense of big physicality, but he's very cerebral and he's very, very calm. His emotional, um, uh, what's the word? Equanimity, I guess. He's really a very calm, logical person who seems almost impossible to knock off, his game a little bit mentally. Like, you can't really get to him that way. And I find that really appealing, because that's where he really, to me, differentiates from those kinds of characters, whether it's Reacher or Rambo or anyone else, right? He really has that very cerebral aspect to him. Maybe if you wouldn't mind addressing that just a little bit about creating that kind of a hero who has that equality between brawn and brains?
Yeah, thank you. That's another great question. Yeah, Carter is he is. I mean, he's an athletic guy, but in my mind, he's only about 5'10". He's wiry. He, he carries, he does carry a gun. He has his trademark outfit is he wears cargo shorts and a short sleeve shirt, and he has a utility vest, and that utility vest is filled with interesting things. Although I definitely have tried not to make this too much of like a MacGyver series at all, so he's not carrying stuff that frankly you can't buy on Amazon. That's a pretty big important part of it. And yeah, right from the beginning, that sense of stability and his ability not to be phased by much was very much part of his character. I mean, um, he will very rarely lose his temper, but certainly he I sort of purposely set out to create a character with a flat affect in a kind of disarming way. And so people encounter him, they underestimate him. They just see this little guy with a kind of goofy outfit. He wears a Rochester Red Wings AAA ball cap a lot because he's a big, AAA baseball fan. And that's all part of the disarming nature of his character, and people tend to underestimate him for that reason. And that was very much part of me creating his persona. I mean, he's very different from my other character, Private Eye Andy Hayes, who is kind of a more blustery guy. Definitely loses his temper, does things to his own detriment, and then has to dig himself out of those messes. Whereas Carter Carter is very self-contained. Now, the one thing I wanted to avoid is this phrase that somebody turned me on to once called competence porn. The idea that you come across a character who feels like they can do no wrong, and they come out of every fight unscathed. And so Carter certainly generally gets the upper hand, but I try to keep it realistic. Like, he is a small guy; he's got to rely on skill sets beyond just a lot of brawn, and he does tend to people to sometimes get the better of him in a fight initially. So that was also part of, I want to make sure that there's a bit of realism in how a guy like this would interact with bigger, stronger people.
As a reader, I really appreciate that because it drives me crazy. And you see it more on TV than anything else, but a gun will go off right next to somebody's head and then they just go on with the story. They don't think anything about it. I don't know how many people out there have actually ever fired a handgun, but a gun without a suppressor on it that goes off within a foot of your ear, your ears are gonna ring for 3 days, right?
Yeah, it's very
Um,
loud.
and you see people get stabbed and shot and all kind, and then 2 weeks later or the next day they're up doing the thing they're doing, and it's like, really? I mean, I've had a paper cut knock me out for an afternoon, right? It's
Yeah,
maybe that says more about me, I don't know, but the point is, it's so unrealistic to me to see people suffer what would be a catastrophic injury or a situation, and they're up and they're at 100% of their capability right away. And I get it, it's fiction, there's a suspension of disbelief, but at some point, you know, you you can't just have people being Superman because that's a different story. So I actually do appreciate when our heroes have some flaws or they have their kryptonites. Those are things that make them a much more interesting character for me to either view or read about. Um, you mentioned Andy Hayes, though, and I'm glad you did because I wanted to segue to that a little bit. And because I'm intrigued by this, because my current manuscript that my agent is out there shopping now uh, features a protagonist who's a former baseball player, and the first in the series takes place a lot in the world of baseball, and it's been a tough sell. And I keep getting all of this positive feedback. Oh, like the writing, like the story. It's this, that, all these positive things. But we're not sure about the baseball setting. So it's been a much longer slog than I had envisioned it was going to be, which is, every writer has that story. But I'm just curious. Andy Hayes as a quarterback, former Ohio State and Cleveland Browns quarterback. Did you run into any issues with that where they said, yeah, or is football so different that people, said, well, that's actually more interesting than, and I also don't know how much of it takes place where when he was still a player. Is it all completely post-career for him, and is that just a backdrop? Maybe give us a little insight, because I have to admit I have not read the series, so give us a little
Sure.
insight into that.
Oh yeah, no, it's a great question. And I will say that you know, I conceived this character several years ago, and sort of I thought it was a pretty original concept, and then afterwards I found out that you could practically have like a labor union of ex PIs, PIs who are ex pro football players. So sometimes I laugh when I see yet another character like that. But let me say that when I first started, I've always been a big fan of the private eye genre, and I'm not a native of Columbus. I moved here 27 years ago, and um, I always tell this story. I'll try to make it brief. That in 1998, the Ohio State football team was undefeated. It was early November. They were marching towards the national championship, and they lost to Michigan State. And at the time, I'd been in Columbus 2 months. I remember at the time thinking distinctly, that's too bad. You know, they're 10-1, and still a great team. And the next day on a Sunday, I was flabbergasted. It was like a state funeral was being held. People were so upset. And honestly, that literally has not changed. We went through the exact same thing 3 or 4 weeks ago when Ohio State lost to Michigan, and people were calling for the coach's head on a pike. The fact that they're now in the national championship may save his job, but the fandom in Ohio for football is unbelievable. Anyway, when I was setting out to create this character, I was looking for that baggage, that what's his dark backstory, and I did think about making him an ex-cop, ex-military. But it occurred to me in Ohio, at least, there's no greater sin that you could commit than to be top of the heap at the Ohio State football team and then blow it all. So Hayes blows it all his senior year. For various reasons, he point shaves. He throws games because he needs money, and that's discovered. He's arrested, and he quickly becomes just persona non grata in Ohio. And I use that as the starting point. So the books all take place sort of 15 to 20 years after that. That's his background. I certainly reference his college days and a little bit of his Cleveland Browns days as backstory, and some of that continues to come back to haunt him. But I always make the point that these aren't really sports books. They're books that have a sports backstory.
Yeah.
And it felt very comfortable, very natural in this case. Again, honestly, because of where this series is set. The Ohio State. I
Yeah.
mean, this is not me saying this, but a sports writer for the Columbus Dispatch after the Michigan loss this year, a sports writer for the Columbus Dispatch said that Buckeye fandom was equivalent to a cult. And
Well,
uh,
a friend of mine, a friend of the show, former NBC baseball writer Craig Calcaterra, who's been on the show because he's got a book on fandom, lives in Columbus, and he's got a great daily newsletter. Well, it's not on Substack anymore, was, but it's a different one now. But anyway, long story short, he had a very similar story to what you just told. He and his wife went out to dinner on the Saturday of the Michigan game, and he thought there was going to be a 2 hour wait, and he hadn't been paying any attention to what was going on that day. And when they got to this restaurant they wanted to go to, there was nobody there. They were able to get right in, and it took him a minute to realize, oh crap, they lost to Michigan today, and there was nobody around. Like this restaurant, which is normally just overflowing with Buckeye fans,
yeah,
gone.
Just
Oh,
and there's certainly plenty of that. We've all heard stories here of people who schedule weddings for a certain Saturday in November, and they quickly have to change the date because there's no way you could hold a wedding in Columbus on the Michigan game day. It's just not done.
yeah, there's a great book out there, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called oh, was it something something Yellow Hammer? It's about
Hmm.
Alabama football, and it's the same thing. There's a story in there of a guy who goes to every single Alabama football game, home and away, doesn't matter. He's got an RV, travels anywhere they're at. He's an older guy. His daughter wanted to get married. He said, "Whatever you do, don't make it during football season." Well, they did, and so he didn't go to the wedding because it was on a day when there was a Bama football game. And she, of course, was very upset. He said, "I warned you not to do it." And I thought, my God,
Wow.
come
Yeah.
on, man. But it is what it is, right? Rammer, Jammer, Yellow Hammer. That's the name of that
Okay.
book if
I'll
you
have to
come
check that
across
out.
it.
Yeah.
But well, I wanted to ask you some, I guess, some process questions about the act and the art of writing, because this is a tough business. It can be a very disheartening business. And so, I've asked a lot of folks who've come on the show, like, oh, how do you handle rejection? And, I think that's very individual for people. So I thought maybe I would ask you, what's maybe the toughest part for you of being a writer in this day and age? Because the industry has changed significantly over the last 20 years. Um, and maybe if not the worst, maybe just what's the part you like the least?
Yeah. It's a great question. You know, there's uh, there's that expression, getting old is not for sissies. And I sometimes feel like the same thing applies to being a writer. I mean, I feel very lucky. I'm a traditionally published author. I have an agent. I've published several novels, but it's there are many days when I still get up in the morning and say, that's it, I'm done. I've had my last great idea. I can't go on. This whatever I'm working on is just a piece of crap. It's horrible. And so I would say sort of the nagging self doubt that pursues me. Um, People might be surprised to hear me say that, but it's true. It's a tough road, and I get plenty of rejections. I get short story rejections all the time, and those aren't easy. But what I always tell other writers is, you know, you have to treat a rejection as an opportunity. That's the only way you can look at it. And yeah, it's not a good moment when you click on that email and you see sorry, but you just have to take a deep breath and move on. And that's part of this other thing I always, tell people that, um, first of all, you're not going to make a lot of money writing. It's no, I mean, unless you're in the, I think, really elite category of writers. But that's actually important to think about because you have to decide why it is you're doing it. And for me, um, I'm not sure what else I would be doing. I mean, to quote a couple of different people, like I'm completely unemployable if I didn't write. Um, and I enjoy writing, and it's something I am going to get up and do every day, regardless of whether I'm published. And I always tell people, you have to play the long game with writing, and I'm talking years. I mean, you have to like look at this for years, even if you're working on your first book. Um, that's just the reality of the industry. If you decide to get an agent, it could take you 3 or 4 years or more to find an agent. People tend to be shocked when they hear that, but that's the reality.
It is the
Agents
reality. And
agents are
you know
being
what?
in.
Even that's not a guarantee. I've had three agents, various reasons the first one, I chose the wrong person. It was a terrible relationship. It didn't work out well at all. The second one was great, but then he stopped repping fiction. So, he went completely to nonfiction, which I was now out of. So back to ground zero. I've got a really good agent now, but and she's doing her best, and we'll see what happens. But I think when I was younger, first getting into this, I thought getting an agent, I'm on my way. This is it, right? Which is why I made a bad decision on who I chose. And I think many of the writers I know that are traditionally published, in particular, can tell you very similar versions of that story where, something didn't work out. I mean, there's just the thing I've always told colleagues of mine or people when they ask me about getting in this, the thing I say, and I don't know, maybe you have a thought on this, is I just always tell them, look, man, you have to decide what you want out of this. If the thing you want is to see your name in print on a book and you don't care how it gets there, then you can self-publish. You don't even have to get an editor. Just do the thing you want to do. But if you want something that's quality that you have a chance to do something with, you're probably going to need to hire an editor. You're going to have a good book designer, cover designer, all those things. And that's even if you're still going to self-publish. If like me and like you, I'm not going to I don't want to do anything like that. I want to be traditionally published. Well, then you better strap in for the long haul because you're trying to hit a moving target from 500 yards with a blowgun. And it's really hard, and you've got to be really, really good at it. And even then, there's a million reasons why you may not work. As I'm working through right now. I mean, all that praise is great. That's great. It's great for my ego, but no one's offered me a contract. So this may or may not work. And if it doesn't end up working, well, I'll go back to ground zero or figure out how to go on. And that's the only thing I can tell people is, in the time that I've been dealing with this book, a friend of mine has published 3 books, but he's gone the self-publication route because that's what he wants. He doesn't care about the other stuff. He doesn't want to. Great. And he's perfectly happy. He's thrilled actually. And that's great. Hasn't made one dime. He's lost money in all of them, but he's perfectly happy with them. And I think that's fantastic. I'm a huge supporter. So that's yeah, I don't know if you have a thought on that, but that's my perspective. I think you just have to
No,
decide.
I think you've said it. I mean, in the end, the reward has to be the writing, and I liked how you put that. You have to decide what it is you want out of it. But you know, just to, I mean, I was a journalist for 34 years, and you know, even though towards the end I was doing less daily journalism and a little bit more project-based journalism, in journalism, you still generally get a pretty regular reward of your story being published for whoever you work for. Your byline's out there. And a lot of that goes away when you're a writer. You go a year before your work is published. And, I go through this all the time. It sounds silly about, I'll get a nice review and then nothing happens. And then like 2 weeks pass and I don't get any more emails about the book. And again, the self-doubts creep in um, and I have to remind myself, like, you like doing this. You like creating these characters. The process is important to you. Keep doing that and stop focusing on this external stuff because otherwise you'll drive yourself crazy.
Yeah, I think we all have that talk. I like this, or what often happens in my case, my wife will say, "But I thought you liked doing this, right?" Yeah, you're right. I know. I'm just sitting here complaining, but I'm glad also you mentioned your journalism career because it's, again, my regular audience knows well, these days I'm an editor more than a reporter. I'm the editor of a publication. We cover the California State Capitol, and it's a very busy job. Keeps me very, very busy, especially right now with a lot of stuff going on. And uh, it makes me um, curious because a lot of the fiction writers I know are former reporters. And that's great because they understand deadlines, certainly, and they understand the economy of writing, and most of them are very good writers. Um, but I'm interested just how many move to fiction instead of sticking with nonfiction. And I know you've done both. You've got a couple of books of nonfiction on weighty topics, terrorism, and capital punishment. I'm curious, were you ever torn? Did you ever think, look, I'm just going to stay with nonfiction because I've been doing this for so long? Or what was the draw to you to go and put so much of your time and energy almost exclusively into writing fiction?
Yeah, so I certainly, I mean, my two nonfiction books were my first two books. I was still a full-time AP reporter when I wrote those. And I did very much envision myself. There was a path I saw where I was a person who was a narrative nonfiction slash, yeah, narrative nonfiction writer. And I think in my case, what happened was I also had this long standing love of mysteries. I mean, going back to a kid, going back to the Encyclopedia Brown days. And part of what was happening was uh, writing the first private eye novels was a frankly kind of a refreshing break from my day job. I mean, so I could get up pretty early in the morning and spin stories that I could just make up. Now, we, I could spend an entire day talking about the importance of getting facts right in your fiction. So there's that whole element of it. But it it was very enjoyable to be writing about a guy wandering the mean streets of Columbus, solving mysteries in a fictional fashion, and then turning around and at least pre-COVID, literally getting in a car, driving to an office, and spending a day on an entirely different kind of writing and reporting. So that yin yang really nourished me for a long time. I think COVID changed a lot of that in my mind. I I started, and journalism changed. I was kind of ready to move on from what I was doing. I do have a true crime book that my agent has been shopping, and I'm not quite ready to give up on that yet, based on a more recent Columbus case. But we'll see if that ever sees the light of day. So I think for now I am committed to pursuing the fiction, but certainly I owe my entire mystery writing career to my job as a journalist because it got me my first two books published. That led to a mystery contract, and as you said, I feel like the discipline I learned as a journalist. People always ask me. I get this question all the time. What do you do about writer's block? And if I'm feeling flip, I say, I look it up in the dictionary to see what that is. Um, when you're a journalist, you can't afford to have writer's
Right.
block.
You don't get the
It's just not,
luxury of writer's
yeah,
block when you have an
it's just
editor
not,
standing over your
yeah.
shoulder.
I mean, how do you defeat writer's block? Get a mortgage, have kids. And that has stuck with me. I mean, so now, I mean, what I will say in a more gentle fashion is, yeah, I have writing challenges. There are days when I sit down and, that especially when I'm mid manuscript, I always, I don't loop back when I'm writing very much, but I do each morning read over and edit what I wrote the day before. And I find that a good way to get into the process. But the fact of the matter is, if that takes me 30 minutes or whatever, I do come to a moment when that cursor is now blinking on a page of white. And that can be tough. Can't lie. There are times when I'm just stuck, but I know no other way than to just kind of focus. And yeah, I'll get up and wander around, make myself another cup of coffee. But I think it's important to just keep a certain focus. I mean, when I
Yeah.
write for my content creation, I have a pretty strict rule of no. I certainly don't look at email or social media during the 2 or 3 hours I devote to my writing. That's just steadfast, and I think that has served me well because that does create a certain focus that it oftentimes gets me over those writing challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule of thumb for everything. I mean, you know, uh, being distracted in this day and age by email, social media, we just have stuff coming at us from every direction. And I have to have that conversation with myself sometimes, what my belief, because, in theory, when you're in charge of things, your belief in your head is that you have to respond immediately to things and always be on top of things. And That's not really true. I think sometimes that's a story I tell myself when, you know, and it's more of an excuse to be undisciplined about the thing I'm doing. So I've had to learn to carve out a particular time and say same thing. Looking at my email. I'm not looking at the internet. I'm not doing anything for this hour, 2 hours, whatever time frame I've said it is. This is what I'm doing, and everything else can wait. And lo and behold, the world is still spinning on its axis. The sun is still
Yeah.
coming up in the east and setting in the west. Nothing society hasn't collapsed because I didn't answer somebody's flippant email the 5 minutes after they sent it. But it's really hard. Those of us who were born with the responsibility gene, which every reporter I know has in
Sure.
spades, which is at least if you're any good at it it's very hard to overcome. But I only have one more serious question, and then we're going to wrap this up. I don't want to keep you all day here, but I do have. A, I'm really curious about your thoughts on crafting a really good first line of your story, whether it's a short story or a novel. Because we're starting to really focus a lot of attention on that in the writing world and the importance of having a really good first line. And there are some guys out there who are just great at it. What's your thought on, do you put a lot of time into the first line of whatever you're writing, or is it something you go back and look at, or is it more for you like a first page? And what's just your thought on how you intro your things that grab somebody?
Yeah, I do. I spend a lot of time on it. It's a great question, and there's absolutely no question that this has changed in the past few, I'd say, few decades. It is a lot harder to meander your way into a novel anymore, and um, you know that saying you can't judge a book by its cover, absolutely wrong. People judge books by their covers constantly. That's why you need a really good cover, because when people browse in a bookstore or library, they look at covers. I look at covers. Same thing with that opening page. I spend a lot more time on it now than I used to, because I recognize that if someone is looking at my book in a bookstore or the library, yeah, if they like the cover, then they're going to open it up. They're going to look at that first page. And if that doesn't grab them, they're going to move on. So I'm not, so I mean, the short answer is I spend an increasing amount of time making sure that that opening line, that opening paragraph is strong. I want to give people a sense that there is a lot at stake here. Um, and, as part of that, I'm not a big prologue person. I have done prologues in the past, but I discourage writers from using prologues anymore, partly because of the sense a lot of prologues I read, um, they just delay the action. Nothing's happening. It's interesting setup, but I think unless it's a really strong prologue, I think it's better just in crime fiction anyway. I think it's just better to drop people right into the action and go from there. So I think it's for younger writers out there. I do think it's super important to make sure that your opening sentence, opening paragraph, definitely opening page needs to be really strong. You need to set up a conflict. A character has to be in conflict with something. You need to give a person a reason to keep reading, because, I mean, yeah, we have so many distractions. Social media, the internet. Oh yeah, 600 scripted streaming shows on the various streaming platforms now. There's so much to watch, and all that is begging for people's attention. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
you really have to give readers a reason to keep going right from the start.
Yeah. Because reading is not passive. You're asking people to participate in something. And they have to physically do things, whether it's on their Kindle or on a book. They physically have to do things. TV, they can just sit there like a lump and let it roll over them, right? So you're
Yeah,
actually asking people to be participatory, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger ask, it seems. Um, which I think is actually one of the reasons people, I think, are really drawn to thrillers, to crime fiction, to things because there is stuff happening. I think the real struggle in this day and age is literary, and because the literary still has a tendency sometimes to meander a little bit. And if you're a fan of literary stuff, that's great. You expect that. But for somebody who's not, or maybe just marginally, and they get used to like, yeah, a dead body in the first 5 pages or an action or something like that. Once that becomes your norm and your expectation, you can't let people down. They will put that thing down and never pick it up again. It'll become a great books, a doorstop or something. That's about the end of it.
Yeah.
Well, I like to end the show. And I appreciate you sticking around this long. I try not to keep people this long, but I love having a great conversation with writers. So obviously that's my gig. But I always like to end the show by playing the omnipotent person who can put you together, let's say for lunch, dinner, drinks, something with one of the following three people. There is a little bit of a theme. You might pick it up real quick. Uh, you tell me who you would choose and why. And the options that I'm going to give you are the late Ohio State coach Woody Hayes, football coach Woody Hayes, legendary, the actress Halle Berry, or another guy you may have heard of named Charles Manson. I can put you together, maybe a distant conversation with any one of those three. Who would you choose and why?
Wow. Well, I'm going to eliminate Charles Manson. A friend of mine, Jeffrey Smalden, just wrote a great memoir about his correspondence with, among other people, Charles Manson. So I feel like I know absolutely as much about that guy as I ever want to know. Um, and wow, that's a tough. I certainly admire Halle Berry as an actor, for sure. But you know what? I'll go with Woody Hayes. That was one complicated person. Uh, and talk about a guy with baggage and a sense of moral rectitude who got in the way of himself. It would be fascinating to hear, especially if he was in a position, maybe an ethereal position, to reflect back on his life and career and get some perspective on that. So I'll go with Woody.
Yeah, I started in sports. I'm a big sports guy, and more baseball than football. But yeah, I mean, anybody of a certain age certainly remembers Ohio State in those glory years, and Ohio State and SC or UCLA meeting in the Rose Bowl quite a bit when those games really mattered as singular bowl games and that kind of a thing. And it was such a sad way for him to end the way his career ended, right? He was essentially made himself into a little bit of a pariah, and it's sad because I think his positives were probably really positive, but man, yeah, the negatives for people like that are, and I see it all the time in politics where they're their own worst enemy, right? But
Right.
for anyone who didn't pick up on it, the theme was all three of those folks, Halle Berry, Woody Hayes, and Charles Manson, are intricately linked with the state of Ohio. Halle Berry and Charles Manson are both born in Ohio, as was Woody Hayes, of course, with Ohio State University. So there's my theme. Probably not that hard to figure out. Um, well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate hearing all of your insights. I've been really loving reading The Mailman. I can't wait to finish it. I wish I'd been able to get through it before we are able to talk today, but that won't be too long. It's really a thrill ride. I really hope when it comes out in a couple weeks from when we're recording this today, people go out and grab a copy because it's really going to be worth your time. If you like thrillers, this is going to be one you like. It's really fast paced. So appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all
Oh,
your thoughts
great to
on
be
writing
here.
and publishing and the industry. And wish you all the greatest of success.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great conversation.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave you all with the same thing I always leave you with, which is this: hit subscribe. But then after that, remember, tomorrow's not promised to any of us, so whatever you do, please make today count. Until then, I'm Rich Eisen. This has been the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words. Take care.